From the air, a Vietnamese village looked like nothing at all. A cluster of thatch-roofed huts, a few garden plots, maybe a canal running past a stand of palm trees, smoke drifting from a cook fire, a water buffalo standing in a paddy. Quiet. But the quiet was the problem. Somewhere beneath that ordinary ground, there might be weapons cached in sealed plastic, ammunition buried under a latrine, a tunnel entrance hidden behind a pigsty, or a squad of guerrillas who had known the Americans were coming since the helicopters spooled up 30 miles away. The village was small, the war inside it was not, and the men sent to search it had to find what was hidden without destroying what was real, in a country where the two were almost impossible to tell apart. The formal doctrine for village searches had been codified as early as December 1962, when American military advisors published their first lessons learned on the subject, and those procedures remained the foundation for every village search that followed. Each mission had to be carefully and completely planned and based on current intelligence. Reports from provincial reconnaissance units, captured documents, informants, and aerial photography all fed into the picture of what a particular hamlet contained and who controlled it. But the picture was never complete. Village populations shifted. Guerrilla units rotated through campsites on unpredictable schedules. Orders were accompanied by briefings built around a sand table mock-up of the target village, a physical model of the terrain, so that every squad leader could walk through his assigned sector before the operation began. Where security restrictions allowed it, rehearsals were conducted using a similar village. Security and counterintelligence took on enormous importance during the planning and briefing phases. Viet Cong intelligence nets were always seeking information about upcoming operations, and a single leak, one conversation overheard, one document left unattended, one interpreter with divided loyalties could turn a surprise cordon into a wasted exercise. Deceptive methods had to be employed during movement to prevent the enemy from learning the true destination and route of march. False insertions, feints toward other hamlets, and deliberate misdirection were standard procedures. The goal was to close the distance between the staging area and the village faster than the warning network could empty it. This was the central tactical problem of every village search operation, and a solution that worked most consistently was speed. The helicopter provided the best means of rapid movement to the objective village, at a speed that surpassed the Viet Cong warning net entirely. No runner, no signal chain, no whispered message could keep pace with a flight of Hueys inbound at 100 knots. Air insertion was preferred for the surprise it delivered. Overland movement was slower, but had its own tactical value. Troops advancing on foot through surrounding fields sometimes flushed guerrillas hiding in outlying positions, killing or capturing them before they could reach the village. The ideal approach combined both methods, air-inserted blocking forces sealing the perimeter while ground elements swept inward. Timing had to be precise. The blocking force had to be set before the assault element advanced, or the cordon would have gaps when the guerrillas were most motivated to run. When it worked, the village was sealed before anyone understood what was happening. Since there were no front lines in counter-guerrilla operations, the first step in any village search was to isolate the target. The area had to be sealed so that there could be no escape from and no entry to the village during the operation. The second step was to clear the isolated area up to the village itself. Ideally, guerrillas discovered outside the village were killed or captured before they reached the houses. The third step was the search proper, which resembled conventional town fighting, except that force had to be applied with extreme caution in the presence of a passive or friendly populace. The final steps were to capitalize on the government's presence through civic action and psychological operations, and then to execute a successful withdrawal once the mission was complete. Blocking forces were positioned in a ring around the target hamlet to seal it completely. Nothing in, nothing out. By January 1967, the technique had been tested on its largest scale during Operation Cedar Falls, when over 30,000 American and South Vietnamese troops cordoned and searched the Iron Triangle north of Saigon. The principles remained the same, regardless of whether the operation involved a platoon or a division. sufficient forces had to hold the entire line of encirclement at all times and still provide a reserve. While it was desirable to use natural obstacles, rivers, canals, and dense vegetation to assist in sealing the area, experience had shown that the Viet Cong consistently escaped by passing over obstacles or through areas that fire could not cover. Physical troop density on the perimeter was the only reliable seal. As blocking forces assumed their final positions on the line of encirclement, they had to remain alert for 4 distinct threats. The first was escape attempts by individuals or small groups trying to slip through gaps in the cordon. The second was determined breakout attempts in force, particularly if the village contained a hardcore unit or vital supplies. The third was attack from Viet Cong forces outside the perimeter who were attempting to relieve the isolated village. The fourth was emergency exits from underground installations emerging beyond the line of encirclement. Tunnel systems running more than 2.5 miles in length were documented in the Republic of Vietnam. A guerrilla who dropped into a spider hole inside the village could surface in a tree line far behind the blocking force. A portion of the blocking force was designated as a mobile reserve, and its mobility was essential. Eagle Flight teams or mechanized infantry mounted on M113 armored personnel carriers were commonly used in this role, positioned for rapid response to breakout attempts or pursuit of individuals who had slipped through the line. This reserve, rather than units pulled from the line of encirclement, handled those situations. The logic was simple. Pulling a squad off the perimeter to chase one man created a gap that 10 more could use. The reserve also covered the possibility of tunnel exits emerging well beyond the cordon, where a guerrilla could surface behind the blocking force and vanish into the countryside. The discipline required was straightforward. Hold the line, watch everything, react to nothing without orders, and let the reserve handle the chasing. Once the village was sealed, the assault force moved to the objective. A variety of methods were used to conduct this advance. An inner line of encirclement could be formed that tightened on the village, or troops would advance from one or more principal directions in small task forces. During this movement, any Viet Cong encountered were to be killed or captured before they could reach the village. The advancing units had to be especially alert for ambush and booby traps in the ground between the perimeter and the first row of houses. If the force was well organized and of sufficient size, the Viet Cong were unlikely to defend the village. But if the hamlet contained a hardcore unit or critical supplies, or if the government troops appeared poorly coordinated, the guerrillas could take aggressive action. The assault force was organized into 5 distinct teams, each assigned a specific function within the village. The reconnaissance team led the way into the objective from the line of encirclement, generally numbering less than 1/3 of the total assault force. Its mission was to secure the area between the cordon and the edge of the hamlet, clearing the approach route as it moved. Once the search teams entered the village, the recon element shifted to local security and served as a small reserve for the assault force commander. The clear separation of responsibilities mattered. A reconnaissance team that drifted into searching left nobody covering the flanks. A search team that got pulled into a security role left houses unchecked. The structure existed because the complexity of the work demanded it. The search teams made up about 1/2 of the assault force and carried the main burden of the operation. They moved quickly but carefully into previously assigned search areas, advancing alternately by bounds from house to house under the cover of one another. All areas were checked. Every structure entered, every suspicious patch of ground probed. Search teams were armed with automatic weapons, fragmentation and offensive grenades, and in some cases specialized detection equipment. The standard was literal: leave no stone unturned. Almost any place above or below ground in a village was a potential hiding spot, from false ceilings and mud walls to buried caches in gardens and animal pens. The Viet Cong had demonstrated too many times that the obvious hiding place was exactly the one that got overlooked, and that the cost of a missed cache was paid later by someone else. The fire support team, usually no more than 1/4 of the assault force, positioned itself where it could deliver fire support to the search teams if the situation deteriorated. This element was equipped with light mortars and, where warranted, light recoilless weapons and additional automatic weapons. The team would approach the village but rarely enter it, since its primary value lay in the indirect fire support it provided from outside. Flat trajectory weapons were the exception, brought forward only when specific bunkers or fighting positions had to be suppressed directly. The fire support team served as the commander's insurance against the operation going wrong, a standoff capability that could suppress enemy positions without the search teams having to fight their way through problems that heavier weapons could solve from a safer distance. The civilian control team assumed temporary custody of villagers as they were uncovered and grouped them together, out of the path of the search teams and out of the line of fire. During the time available, they segregated and interrogated civilians, checked documentation, and gathered whatever intelligence the situation offered. They watched specifically for guerrillas attempting to meld with the population and detained anyone who could not establish their identity or account for their presence in the village. Suspects were usually evacuated for more detailed interrogation at a later time. The prisoner of war team, a very small element of the assault force, secured and processed confirmed combatants under the standard principles: seize, search, segregate, silence, and speed in evacuation. Both the civilian control and POW teams were augmented with psychological warfare and civic action personnel when those specialists were available. Items of special equipment were available to speed up the search and make it more thorough. Mine detectors gave search teams a significant advantage. Equipment like the ANPRS-3 could detect metallic booby traps, including spike traps, grenades, and mines. More importantly, some detectors could identify underground cavities, which might have been hidden rooms, foot traps, or tunnel entrances. Since metal was uncommon in rural Vietnamese construction, a mine detector swept across the walls and ceilings of a building could reveal concealed weapons caches that no visual inspection would find. A rifle could be detected under 12 inches of mud or 20 inches of water. The use of mine detectors not only increased the speed and effectiveness of the search, but also minimized friendly casualties from booby traps and prevented the unnecessary destruction of dwellings. Military dogs trained as scouts provided another critical layer of capability that human senses alone could not replicate. They could locate underground installations and alert their handlers when those installations were occupied, a distinction that mattered enormously when a tunnel might contain armed guerrillas or might be empty. In dry conditions, dogs were also effective at finding buried equipment. They were sometimes used to lead units to the objective village and warn of enemy ambushes along the approach route. When used in search operations, dogs increased the speed of the search, helped ensure thoroughness, and provided a degree of security to the assault force. Riot control munitions and white phosphorus grenades rounded out the specialized equipment carried by search teams, used primarily to drive guerrillas from their underground positions when they refused to come out willingly. Demolitions equipment was essential for dealing with the tunnel systems that could not be left intact behind a departing force. 40-pound cratering charges were placed near tunnel entrances, and 10-pound bags of CS1 powdered riot control agent were distributed through the tunnel at turns and intersections, tied into the main demolition charge with detonating cord. The tunnel rats, soldiers who went underground with a flashlight, a small caliber pistol, a compass, and a field telephone trailing wire behind them, probed ahead with bayonets for booby traps, calling compass headings and distances to teammates on the surface who plotted the tunnel layout in real time. Small caliber pistols, or pistols with silencers, were the weapons of choice underground, because larger weapons had been known to collapse tunnel sections when fired and could rupture eardrums in the confined space. A tunnel complex searched by the 1st Battalion, Royal Australian Regiment during Operation Crimp in January 1966 illustrated the scale of what could lie beneath ordinary ground. The main tunnel ran roughly 700 yards. The longest straight stretch was about 30 feet. Every 50 yards there was a side tunnel or offshoot. The average passage was 2 feet wide and 2.5 to 3 feet high. Air shafts were spaced throughout, conical in shape, about 12 inches at the base and 2 inches at the top. Every 100 yards there was a room, roughly 4 by 6 feet, with shelves along one wall. Waterlocks and airlocks acted as firewalls between sections. Some complexes were interconnected over distances of 3 to 4 miles, with the connecting passages known only to selected personnel. The actual conduct of the search resembled conventional town and village fighting, in that search teams employed the same techniques of movement from house to house, clearing and thoroughly checking each possible hiding place, both inside dwellings and in the surrounding village. But the Viet Cong had seeded the ground with devices designed to make that work lethal. Between January 1965 and June 1970, 11% of American fatalities and 17% of American wounds were caused by mines and booby traps. Non-explosive traps included punji stakes, sharpened lengths of bamboo or metal with fire-hardened tips, often smeared with excrement to cause infection. These were set in shallow camouflaged holes, along paddy edges, and wherever a soldier was likely to land hard, behind a log during a firefight, in a ditch, at the edges of likely helicopter landing zones. Side-closing pits drove spikes into the legs from multiple angles, specifically designed to defeat the reinforced sole of the American jungle boot by attacking the softer leather and canvas above it. Swinging man-traps, weighted beams on a fulcrum, were concealed on trails and heavily camouflaged. A pressure plate swung the spiked end upward with enough force to impale a man through the chest. Tripwire bamboo whips lashed across trails at chest height, driving poisoned spikes into anything in their path. Explosive traps were equally varied and considerably more lethal. Mud ball mines were clay-encrusted grenades with the safety pin removed. Stepping on the ball released the lever. Cartridge traps were rifle rounds buried nose up, with the primer resting on a nail. The Grunts called the small caliber versions toe poppers. Daisy chains of command-detonated grenades were strung along trails where patrols were expected. Dud artillery shells and bombs, many of them American-made 105mm rounds, were salvaged and converted into massive directional mines. The locations that were usually mined included roads, road edges, village approaches, gaps in fences and walls, and crossing places at streams and canals. Bouncing betties, pressure release mines that armed when stepped on and detonated when the foot lifted, were among the most feared devices encountered in the war. A soldier could step on one, hear the arming mechanism click, and stand frozen, knowing that any movement would launch the mine to chest height before it exploded. The raw materials for this industry were frequently of American origin. Discarded ammunition, abandoned munitions, and unexploded ordnance provided the ingredients. In early 1968, one company of the 1st Battalion, 20th Infantry, sustained over 40% casualties in 32 days, almost entirely from booby traps and snipers. The fear of mines and booby traps was so pervasive that it slowed every advance to a crawl, diverted resources toward guard duty and clearance operations, and created severe mental fatigue on both the commanders at platoon level and the individual soldier's walking point. The threat was often enough to accomplish the enemy's objective without a single device detonating. Units in the field operated under constant stress, and that stress did not lift when the search was over. It followed them back to the perimeter. It followed them on the next operation. The psychological toll compounded with each casualty, and the fact that the enemy was rarely seen, that the war was fought against the ground itself, made the damage harder to process than losses taken in a firefight where at least the source of the danger had a face and a direction. Great emphasis was placed on using only that level of force required to conduct the search with the desired degree of thoroughness. Too little force would result in either an inadequate search or would give the Viet Cong the opportunity to counterattack the searching units. Too much force would alienate the populace, making the ultimate task of establishing government control harder than it had been before the operation began. The Viet Cong understood this dynamic better than the Americans did, and sometimes arranged their defenses specifically to provoke an overreaction that would turn the population against the government. A water buffalo shot by a nervous rifleman, a door kicked off its hinges, a rice store scattered across the floor of a dwelling, and a village that had been passively tolerating the government could become actively hostile before the search teams had even finished their work. In order to obtain maximum benefit from the search, it was necessary to capitalize on the government's presence in the village. The ultimate goal in counterinsurgency was to re-establish government control over the people, and no opportunity to prepare the population to accept that control could be overlooked. Civic action and psychological operations teams were planned into the operation from the start. While search teams cleared houses on one side of the hamlet, civil affairs personnel distributed medical supplies, assessed village needs, and broadcast messages making the case for cooperation. Often it was impossible to leave civic action cadre behind after the operation ended. But the details were pre-planned to extract the greatest possible effect from the limited time available, and members of the participating military units were briefed on what they could do during and after the search, even without dedicated specialists. Withdrawal of the assault forces was carried out over a different route than the one taken during the advance. The assault force pulled back to the line of encirclement, which remained in position until joined by the departing search teams. All forces then withdrew together, those not using helicopter extraction moving out on multiple routes, each one different from the ones used coming in. Viet Cong ambushes were most common when units were returning from operations, and extreme caution had to be exercised during the withdrawal and return to home station. The guerrillas who had escaped the cordon or who had watched the operation from positions outside it had hours to prepare. They knew the pattern. They counted on tired men walking carelessly back toward the promise of a hot meal and dry ground. Trails were mined. Choke points along stream and canal crossings were pre-registered for mortar fire or heavily booby-trapped. Claymore mines, both American-made and Chinese copies, were positioned along likely routes of march, their fan of fragments covering a 60-degree arc. Even areas that had been cleared during the approach could be seeded with traps during the operation itself, because the Viet Cong were resourceful enough to emplace devices behind a force that had already passed through. The withdrawal demanded the same alertness as the approach, flankers out, intervals maintained, point men sharp, nobody walking the same ground twice. The discipline required on the walk back was identical to the discipline required on the walk in, and experienced commanders enforced it that way because the men who let their guard down on the return were the men who did not come back. Speed and thoroughness were the key elements of success in all village search operations. Speed was essential to achieve surprise and capitalize on its effect. Thoroughness could not be sacrificed for the sake of speed. Once a village had been entered, the search had to be completed, and complete. But the operation itself contained a contradiction that no amount of training or coordination could resolve. A search was a snapshot, one frame pulled from the life of a place that existed before the Americans arrived and would go on existing after they left. The guerrillas who were found were removed, the tunnels were blown, the weapons were confiscated, and then the helicopters lifted off, and the village was still there. The people were still there. The conditions had not changed. The village remained, and so did the war.